In his research, John discovered links between the characters, assassins, funding, and operations in the murders of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and numerous other public figures and eyewitnesses to the killings. John did 3 years of original research into the real story behind the murders, not the suicides, at Jonestown, and their links to military intelligence and the CIA program called MK Ultra, a program for both individual and mass mind control. In addition to printed articles in Mutiny Reader, Conspiracy Digest, and Critique, his analysis has appeared in Spy and Newsweek. He has lectured at dozens of colleges and universities and has appeared on hundreds of radio and television interview shows over the years. I might add, for those of you who didn't catch it last week, John was interviewed a week ago, Tuesday afternoon, by Bruce Fisher on KGU AM 760 out of Honolulu. And they originally had planned for John to be on for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and they ended up bumping other guests, and John was on for a full 2 hours. Finally, I would like to say that unlike the vast majority of researchers in this field, John is willing to take the evidence he uncovers and proceed to logical, rationally justified conclusions wherever the evidence may lead. There have been literally only a handful of researchers over the past 30 years willing to do this. Penn Jones Jr., Mae Brussel, Joaquin Yosten, and John Judge. The Cold War may be over, but we here in the United States and the people in many other countries are, as John says, still in the death grip of militarism and the devastating covert machinations of the national security state. John Stockwell, former CIA official during the Cold War, estimates the number of innocent victims since World War II of CIA and Pentagon operations to be in the neighborhood of 10 million people. As of yet, there will be no glasnost or perestroika for us, nor the other victims around the world. If that day ever does come, I feel it will be at least partly due to the courageous work of our speaker, John Judge.
Thanks for the nice introduction, Richard. There are some flyers up here that have the address for prevailing winds, so we didn't have enough catalogs. And I wanted to say first, and aloha to Maui. The 2 times that I've been here have been some of the best times I've spent anywhere. And the people and the location are very important. I think I've been trying to gather materials each time I've come and writings about the indigenous peoples here and their history, the true history of U.S. involvement. Richard was nice enough to loan me this PBS special. If you haven't seen it, you should, called Act of War, done by 2 women here. It tells the real history of the sordid history of the usual machinations of how countries are created on behalf of colonial powers and people that want to make a profit. And I've also been trying to read what I can in terms of the sovereignty movement that's growing at this point, and I think is an important development. And a special thanks also to Richard for all of his efforts in getting flyers around and arranging the room and the talk on KGU that made this meeting possible. And for all of you, we had no idea whether the turnout would be 6 or 60, but apparently word got out or someone saw it, and it's nice to see so many of you here. I'm going to talk tonight primarily about cults and how those are defined, and secret societies and their role in things as I see them. But I have done a lot of work on the political assassinations, and I'm sure we'll have an extensive question and answer session when I'm done on this topic, so that won't be my topic tonight primarily, but it'll touch on it. But if you have questions about that, we can get into them later. I don't know how many of you follow the Maui news. Tuesday, while I was here, this cartoon appeared out of the Chicago, it's syndicated, McNally, and it shows two ghouls digging up John Connolly's grave. And the one says, and when we dig out all these bullet fragments, he looks a little bit like Gerald Ford. The other one says, we match them with the ones I found in my Diet Pepsi. And the two ghouls are marked conspiracy nuts. There's only three official kind of nuts. There's lone nuts who do all the shooting. There's the people who don't believe in lone nuts. Those are conspiracy nuts. And then there's a third category that the Secret Service called White House cases. Those are people who come knocking at the door of the White House and make too much of an effort to get in, and about 160 of those a year are locked up in St. Elizabeth's, the federal mental ward, and they have a diagnosis for them that they're delusional because they think the President of the United States wants to help them. I think a lot of us have that delusion. But the reason that the conspiracy nuts were after Connolly's bullet fragments is not because we have a morbid fascination with death. We do have a morbid fascination with the wrong death. But because those fragments are probably the only evidence that, where you could have a hope of a clean chain of evidence linking the bullet fragment to whatever was supposedly fired that day, because they've been inside Connolly's body all that time. And interestingly enough, they should have labeled one of these guys FBI, because they also called for the fragments to be removed from Connolly's body and identified. They've got just about as much stake in it now as we have in terms of getting anybody to believe their version of the Kennedy assassination. But the Connolly family said no, which didn't surprise us. Connolly himself, I believe, was in the know about the assassination on Kennedy, and very close to many of the principals, and made quite an argument that morning at the airport that he didn't want to sit up front in Kennedy's car. And at the time the bullet first struck him, the words from his mouth were, "My God, they're going to kill us all." And he was mad enough about it that over the years, while he said he supported the Warren Commission conclusions, his description of the bullet and the timing of the bullet always spoke to a second shot, not to one shot hitting both of them. So he sort of went both ways. Cults, which I assume the modern word is a shortening of occult, the secretive or the arcane, and secret societies have flourished, as well as been created in both the media and by the government over the years. And there's quite a debate going on right now about what constitutes a religion and who or what has civil rights protections as a religion within the society. Some of you may know that there's quite a debate going on between New Age people and the Christian fundamentalists, who are convinced that anything slightly different than mainline Catholic and Protestant religion is by definition Satanism. I'm not here really tonight to talk about my definition of those things, but I do want you to understand that I know the difference between Wiccan and witches and Satanism and devil worship, and I know the difference between things that are important to be afraid of and things that you shouldn't concern yourself with. But a great deal of flap goes on currently, for instance, about satanic child abuse. And while I'm sure it happens, I doubt that it's anywhere near as exhaustive or extensive as Christian child abuse. But we don't get doubly upset by Christians doing it, just Satanists. Not all mainstream religions are good for you, and not all occult and spiritual paths are bad for you. People in the graduating class were tapped by Skull and Bones to be part of this fraternity in their senior year, and then would get, I mean, they're basically made for life because they were being tapped by the members of the ruling elite, the robber barons and their families, the richest families in the country. And so in return, I imagine, for this favor of making you for life, you might be willing to give a little back. But just in case, Skull and Bones traditionally initiated people with a criminal activity, which was to dig up the skull and the bones of someone and then put them in a coffin and sleep with them for the evening. That was one. I mean, there was another thing where you went through a sexual confessional sequence about your whole life as part of the initiation of Skull and Bones. Now you can imagine Prescott Bush in 1909 and George Herbert Walker Bush going through these initiations. Prescott is said to have dug up Geronimo, and there was, when Bush became president, an Apache delegation actually went and asked for the Skull and Bones back to bury him back in the sacred grounds. There's two stories on Bush. One that it was Zapata that he dug up, the Mexican revolutionary. Another is that it was Emma Goldman. My understanding was that Emma's buried in the Soviet Union, but if he did dig up Emma Goldman, I'm sure she bit him. In any case, that sort of thing existed, and it was a way to initiate these people, and these people figured into, like in Prescott Bush's class, were Brown Brothers and George Harriman, the Brown Brothers Harriman cartel, international banking that was responsible in part for the financing of Hitler and the rise of Hitler. And Bush's father worked quite closely with some of the companies and corporations that were involved in that, and later lost some of their assets when companies that were clearly doing business on both sides were attacked by the government. Another example in the modern world would be, not quite so secret, but still ruling groups. The Trilateral Commission, or the Bilderbergs earlier, was a conglomeration. Still exists, but not as powerful as Trilateral. Trilateral is basically a creation of the Rockefellers, where they drew Japan and Germany into a triumvirate that exists now as, I believe, the New World Axis, on the basis that Japan and Germany don't have any oil. They have no internal oil source. And so they're completely dependent on the Middle East oil, which the Rockefellers were controlling through the Saudi fiefdoms. They educated those people, sent them back, put them in power, and they let OPEC and those things operate as if they were independent of the American oil interests, but they're not, and they would raise the prices artificially. They blocked all pipeline flow down into Europe, which is part of what the continuing military presence of the United States in the Middle East has to do with now, is making sure that there's never a free oil flow to these two major capitalist competitors in the world, Japan and Germany. So they grouped them together. Their top elite meet in this triumvirate called the Trilateral Commission, and somewhat reminiscent of Italy, Japan, and Germany in the 40s, I think, in terms of their extended interest for world manipulation control. The Pentagon, I think, would be another example of quasi-public, but essentially secret society in terms of how it initiates and how the pecking orders go and the influence that it has over the society, and very ineffective civilian control, as you can tell when Clinton balks them a little bit on a discharge policy. He's getting mud in the face and, you know, hasn't asserted himself against them. They probably, the first 48 hours of the presidency, they keep showing you the Zapruder film over and over until you get it. And intelligence agencies, as I mentioned before. These different groups, though, I think you can't look at the Trilateral Commission and say they control the world. These groups compete against each other. The broader historical context for the involvement in these cults, though, I think, has to do with mind control and social control. What George Orwell called the space between our ears, which is sort of the final frontier of the people that want to run this society and manipulate things. And in the 1940s and World War II, the British had been masters at establishing colonial rule through division of tribes or sects or smaller groupings that hadn't even been hostile before, but the colonialists were able to pit them one against another and lead to breakdowns in the social order. That's part of what happened in the real history of Somalia, as a cooperating, basically anarchist group of tribes that then were invaded, and the colonial puppets were the ones that now come up as what we have the audacity to call warlords in Somalia. We don't know anything about war. The United States then relied on its intelligence work with British training, because they had run an empire for 500 years. The U.S. were fledglings in this regard. The oldest U.S. intelligence agency, Naval Intelligence, came out of the British Navy. And the key people there were Sir William Stevenson, a man called Intrepid, Ian Fleming, who later wrote the James Bond books. He and Stevenson wrote the charter of the American CIA in 1946. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the liaison to British intelligence all during World War II, and J. Mortimer Bloomfield up at Camp X in Toronto, where they trained the intelligence squads and the key killing agents during the war. Bloomfield's identified in a number of the works as involved in the Kennedy assassination. For an example of what use British intelligence might have put to this, Hitler was known to have a fascination with the occult and with astrology, and was making some of his political and military decisions based on astrological information he was getting from people in Germany that, you know, did that for reading. British intelligence infiltrated pro-British astrologers so that he was getting psychic disinformation about what to do next based on their astrologer. So you can see that, you know, an intelligence agency might have an interest in taking up with an astrological group. But I think in general, what you need to look at is that at any frontier of psychic or mental consciousness or development, the intelligence agencies want to be the first ones there. Because when something like that breaks, it can either be used for control or it can be used as a weapon. And so they're going to be out there looking for that kind of development and what it is. I mean, we have this book, I don't know if you've seen it, this book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, by these two women who went over the Iron Curtain, found out about all the psychic things they're doing there. Well, these two women have extensive ties to U.S. intelligence agencies. Okay, so whenever you look closely at who's looking at these things, you'll find that connection. And social control in general was a special interest of both the Nazis. They had all kind of propaganda techniques. They actually developed television before the war ended, which is probably the most effective lobotomizing and social control tool anyone's ever had. I mean, I think Goebbels would have cut off his saluting arm for television today. And it was also, of course, an interest of the U.S. and the British. The oldest intelligence agency, ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, which figures into all the assassinations, and which you can find hardly anything about, at that point was using three people primarily in this effort at social and mind control. Nelson Rockefeller, General Edwin Lansdale, and the Mafia. The Mafia and ONI cut deals back into the 40s, long before the CIA started piddling their toes in. ONI and Mafia were using each other for espionage and other connections. And three people at ONI hired within the psychic circles, two from OTO. Well, actually the third one had connections with OTO, but OTO is Ordo Templi Orientis. It was one of the occult societies back then. Extended through time were Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, the great beast, and L. Ron Hubbard. And the three of those were working for the Office of Naval Intelligence in World War II to infiltrate occult societies. Now, Crowley had already done that within his immediate adepts that he was training. Part of their initiation was to infiltrate successfully to the top level of another secret society, and then bring back to him the information about what they were doing. So he was a good key to use in order to infiltrate at that time. Another example of this use for the warfare would be a group of British intelligence, top British intelligence agents that nicknamed themselves the Martians. And they were doing studies on how would they do social control after the war was over. Hitler wasn't there, the enemy wasn't there, how would you control people? And they said, well, maybe an external threat, that we could create the illusion of an outer space invasion, and then we could get people back under manipulation and hegemony. And I mean, this was seriously studied. It wasn't something they sat around with beer and talked about. They tried to find out how they could do project images on clouds, and they had an extensive study of how to bring the Martians here. And then the Nazis themselves were doing extensive testing on the mind in all of their fascist states, in Germany and Japan and Italy. In fact, all the current major psychiatric methodology, including lobotomy and electroshock and brain surgery, were developed in the fascist countries during World War II, and then imported here along with many of the scientists that practiced them. The very first testing on human subjects of electroshock was done by Dr. Mengele at the Auschwitz concentration camp. And they were none too kind to psychiatric inmates in Nazi Germany. They were considered feeble-minded and useless eaters, and they were the first victims of the Holocaust. 300,000 psychiatric inmates were taken by vans of the Public Benefit and Transportation Society to killing centers, 6 killing centers. And 78%, over 300,000 of them, were murdered as part of Hitler's early, first they sterilized and then they murdered. This is 37, 38, long before the broader Holocaust. And the psychiatrists who developed those killing centers, which included gas chambers and crematoria, became the experts, who then were sent to Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz and the larger camps for the broader Holocaust in order to tell them how to do it. Another person involved in social control in those years, from the 20s on and well known by the 40s, was Freud's nephew, who was already an expert in social control via advertising. And many of those techniques were just shifted over to do the war propaganda during World War II and then post-war propaganda since then. Another person working in the World War II period with Army intelligence was B.F. Skinner. He was training pigeons for Army intelligence for reconnaissance at that point. He's the one, if you don't know him, the psychiatrist who believes that all human activity is determined and therefore we should just condition certain activity. He has a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, as if we don't know what's out there. In 1946 to 48 then, in the immediate post-war years, all of this intelligence pays off. Allen Dulles, eventually director of the CIA, and John J. McCloy, the head of the Allied Command for Europe in the post-war period, pardon and hide key Nazi war criminals. And they locate, from 46 to 48, key technicians within the scientific Nazi states and import them into the United States. The Office of Naval Intelligence, specifically, again, Nelson Rockefeller, this time with Richard Nixon and C.D. Jackson of the loose time propaganda empire, and really basic salesman for the Cold War, conspire to bring these Nazis here. And the two Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles in State and Allen in CIA, construct this massive Cold War lie that the first part of the lie is that communism is the new enemy, it's just as bad as fascism. The other part of the lie, which people don't concentrate on, is that fascism is dead, that it died in a bunker in Germany with Adolf Hitler, who was neither there nor was Eva Braun, nor did fascism die at all, but expanded itself all around the world. It was an excuse then to this Cold War ideology to bring anyone in who could help them against the communists, including these fascist scientists and war criminals. And they peopled the beginnings of our Central Intelligence Agency, our Voice of America, and the propaganda arms of the Cold War. On General MacArthur's staff, his G2 Army intelligence staff let the Japanese experimenters off the hook. And Richard gave me, if I've seen this, got it cheaply at I think about $5. Unit 731 is a story about the Japanese units that experimented on human prisoners in World War II, but because we wanted the results of the experimentation, we were willing to let the war criminals go in exchange for the information. The main person that organized that on MacArthur's G2 staff was a person who used the name Charles Willoughby. Willoughby's real name is Shep Wiedenbach, and he was German, proto-fascist, supporter of Hitler, and infiltrated himself into MacArthur's staff. MacArthur himself was pro-Nazi in many ways, and also fit clearly into the anti-communist ideology. And Wiedenbach Willoughby came back to the United States working with Army intelligence to build a huge industrial and civil spy network in the United States that eventually led into COINTELPRO. And, well, it came out recently, I don't know if you saw it, the Martin Luther King assassination, that there was both a group of Green Berets on the site and constant surveillance of King and the Civil Rights Movement dating back to World War I. Okay? And after World War II, the person, I went to a history I have on U.S. Army surveillance, the person responsible for setting up the specific G2 unit to spy on the Civil Rights Movement at that time was Willoughby. And the other major spying network on the Civil Rights Movement at Little Rock was begun then by General Edwin Walker, the guy who Oswald's supposed to have taken a pot shot at. And these people figure into the later assassinations. Joe McCarthy came up in that period, sponsored by military intelligence, who created a new enemy through him, the communists, and started the witch hunt. And by 1948, Dulles said, this was in a letter to Earl Warren that I found in the archives, "We had an ongoing program of psychological manipulation for political purpose," by 1948. What he's talking about there is essentially Manchurian candidate capability. They had controlled and trained assassins by the end of World War II. They weren't spending 30 years bungling around looking for Manchurian candidate. They had it, and they had it established by the end of the war. One of the early and crude methods for technique of control was to put radio transmitters in the teeth. And where people still saying they hear radio messages through their teeth and they're scratched off as being out of their minds. But in fact, the specific dentist that filed the 6 patents for that was the dentist that worked with Uri Geller, a person that I believe to be a fake psychic who said the Martians let him bend spoons, but the alloy of the spoons he had gotten from the Office of Naval Intelligence. And many of the people promoting his psychic career had intelligence backgrounds. And then I even found an incident in the paper that Lucille Ball, during World War II, working with the OSS and US intelligence in France, because of a loose filling in her tooth, which was able to vibrate at the same frequency as the Nazi radio messages going out of France, was taken around in OSS trucks to see if she could locate any Nazi transmitters that were going on in the area. I told that story in Toronto, and Al Nelson, one of the researchers, was sitting next to me. He said, "You've got a lot of splaining to do, Lucy." And also 1948 is important because that's the year that television is introduced into American homes for both liminal and subliminal control. Subliminal messages are sent daily by satellite to all working television sets. And I also found out through someone at Hale Boggs' office that at the time of his death, he was one of the Warren Commission members who dissented and was murdered. His staff was working on something called Operation Octopus. They had dated it back to 1948, and it was a capability for any of these old tube sets that were plugged in and the tubes were hot. They could, over a 25-mile radius, plug into the TV set and hear and see into the living room. So these are the telescreens that Orwell talks about in his book 1984, which really should have been called 1948. And in fact, what he titled it in 39, but when it got to America in 49, they had to change the year so that we'd be as confused as Winston, the protagonist, about what age we live in. In the 1950s, then, they moved this to a testing and technical level at Edgewood Arsenal, at Ivy Labs, up in Pennsylvania, working out of Holmesburg Prison, and they began massive experimentation on mind control with both troops and prisoners. I'm sure they also did it in psychiatric institutions at that point, but I don't have evidence. But any captive population. Dr. Kligman, who worked at Ivy Labs under University of Pennsylvania, went in first for the Army to work on poison ivy. He's the one that invented the birth control pill as an acne control device that had a byproduct. He's a dermatologist. He's from Germany, and he said, I found an article in the 50s when he went in, he said he felt like a farmer standing in front of a fertile field. He saw acres and acres of human flesh and an anthropoid colony that wasn't going anywhere. This is the guy hired by Dow to test dioxin, undiluted, on the skin of prisoners, the poison that's in Agent Orange, without any follow-up studies. And when these guys sued for cancer, the judge sat on the suit till they died, and the suit went out of the Philadelphia courts. He also tested LSD. He tested a drug called BZ, which is a long-term disorienting drug. I don't know if you've seen that film Jacob's Ladder. That's the drug that they're talking about there. He tested on the prisoners there at Holmesburg, and there was a whole prison economy built up around it. The VA hospitals became the site of testing of both psychological drugs and techniques, mind control techniques, and the psychosurgery was done regularly in the VA hospitals. Up to today, in any given month, 8,000 people are being experimented on in the VA hospital system with something. And it was the establishment of a long-term use of veterans as guinea pigs, both in war and afterward. Maybe you've read some of the stories about the health problems that the Gulf War veterans are having because of the oil fires, because of actual nuclear radiation from the tank penetration bullets. They figured uranium's pretty heavy. It'll go through a tank, so they coat it with lead and shoot it into tanks, and then the lead's, of course, stripped off, and you've got live uranium rods out on the battlefield. The third possibility is that these drugs that they were given without any testing beforehand and without FDA testing but FDA approval for wartime, they were given drugs to protect them from chemical and biological weapons that Saddam Hussein supposedly was going to shoot at them. More likely the U.S. would shoot it at them and see what it would do after they give them the shots. But a lot of these guys are sick and they don't know from what, and they're being dealt with about the way the Vietnam vets were when they came back. And in fact, in the book Secret Agenda, Linda Hunt reveals that at least 3 of the doctors working at Edgewood Arsenal on the testing of the drugs were Nazi transplant scientists that had worked on mind control in Nazi Germany. So we brought the techniques here of the fascism. In 1956, Sandoz Chemical invented LSD. And Alan Dulles proceeded within a period of about 2 months to buy 50 million tabs of LSD from Sandoz. Now that's not test level, that's field level. You know, about 50 million tabs to see what it does. Okay, I mean, you have some idea what you want to do with it, and they mixed it with, they put it with other drugs, combined them together, they combined it with electroshock. Dr. Cameron, working on CIA funds up in Canada, the head of the World Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, well-respected scientist up there, tried out psychic driving, where you pour white noise and sounds into people till they forget who they are, forget their whole history, wipe the slate clean, and then start in and program with something else, and victimize people up there trying to find out what they could do. They had names for these things. Project Often was to erase your memory at Holmesburg. Artichoke to make you talk. Bluebird was another one for mind control. MK Delta, MK Naomi, and the ultimate one, MK Ultra, for the overall program lasted, they say 30 years, I say all the way to the present time, still testing human beings for control. The excuse for doing all this testing with government funding was provided by 2 doctors, one working for the Air Force and one working for the Army, at the time of the Korean War. Korean troops who were imprisoned confessed to having used chemical biological weapons against the people in Korea. Eisenhower had already suppressed and jailed a book and the authors of that book that revealed the CBW testing and use that we were doing in Korea. But when the actual pilots were captured and said that they'd been doing it, they didn't want that out. So they sent these 2 doctors. One is named Dr. Jocelyn West from the Air Force, and from the Army, Dr. Robert Lifton, well respected now. And these 2 said that these people had all been brainwashed to give such confessions. And therefore, since our enemies were doing some mystical brainwashing, that we then had to experiment and find out how we could do it ourselves to protect ourselves from it. These 2 people figure in later on as well. They were looking, their goals at that time, according to the documents, were long or short-term memory loss, good for debriefing, truth serums for interrogation, an ability to create assassins or killers to make people kill on command, and to create ability to create second personalities unknown to the conscious mind within an individual that could be drawn forth with certain verbal or light commands, so that you'd have another personality that was under their control within your normal personality that you wouldn't know about. And you'd have missing time, which I think is one of the aspects of the so-called UFO abduction sequence. The missing time is part of this second personality. The drug they used the most, and we still don't know exactly what it is, it's an LSD and psilocybin derivative, was EA, or experimental agent 1729. And once they found the drug that worked, then they took it beyond the controlled testing and began to use it on people without any knowledge. It was tested out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The one doctor who objected to this unethical testing without warning anybody of the EA-1729 and the LSD at Edgewood was himself given the drug unknowingly. Then taken to Chestnut Lodge, a CIA-controlled mental facility, where he was told that he was having a mental breakdown. Then taken to New York to a CIA psychiatrist, and then went out a window in New York with a CIA agent in the room with him. And I don't care if he pushed him. I mean, they took the brakes off anyway. One way or the other, they got him out the window, and it was the end of the story for 30 years. By the 1960s, universities across the United States were then enlisted and made millions of dollars testing these drugs for both the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA on unsuspecting people. In fact, it came out eventually in the admissions of Ken Kesey and Allen Ginsberg and others that all the drugs for the Kool-Aid acid test period were provided from military bases by Army intelligence. And so all the early LSD testing, including Mr. Timothy Leary, who became the snake oil salesman for the generation to tell you to drop acid and drop out, was in fact himself a graduate of West Point and worked at Harvard with the person that developed the psychological profile that was used to pick CIA agents, Mr. Harvey. And Leary worked directly with him and created a situation that eventually, I believe, helped to destroy the counterculture and the political movement of the 60s and any political alternatives or consciousness raising that was going on. That they developed an active drug war against youth. and against conscious people. And that drug war still goes on in a different and more venal form in non-white communities today, especially in black and Hispanic and Asian youth. By the time Nixon came in 1968, the common street drugs for mind expansion like marijuana, LSD in its pure form, or other things that were supposed to expand your mind, disappeared from the street market and were replaced by methaqualone and soporifics, whose purpose was to put you the rest of the way to sleep. They were also testing all through the Vietnam War drugs on the battlefield, including this BZ, which is a kind of back-brain reaction drug. It lasts days, not hours, and it creates tremendous fear. It's like sort of reptilian consciousness, just, you know, protect yourself. These vets told me they would have killed their grandmother if that's who'd been in front of them at the time they took the drugs. They're still trying to project drugs that will keep people awake for 72 hours on the battlefield, make them into programmed killers, and be able to use people with extensions of the killing machine. And in addition, through the 60s, lobotomy, psychosurgery, and electroshock were used extensively. 10,000, for example, 10,000 children were lobotomized in the 1960s before the practice was finally challenged in the Kennedy Committee. One of the scientists who talked to Kennedy about it said, "We don't use lobotomies anymore, we have television." By the 1970s, they had broken through to mass control experimentation beyond individual control. One of the methods for this was wave and frequency control. Wave, low frequency, and microwave and other wave proliferation. And also at that time, there was a great growth in the number of alternative religions and occult societies and alternative groups in the society. The counterculture had spawned, and they were very much threatened by that. Because capitalism depends in part on all of us living in separate house units with our own dishwasher, our own refrigerator, our own lawnmower. If we start living together, sharing things, not buying insurance policies, not putting our money in the bank and bartering with each other, something's going to crack in terms of how the wealth concentrates. And so they were quite upset with the counterculture that developed in that period. There was also going on electronic dissolution of memory. And concentration, both through the television and other methods. And they were experimenting through this individual, Jose Delgado, on brain implantation of devices that would directly feed into portions of the brain and cause certain activities, or could monitor thinking or certain types of brain flare-up for emotion. To both monitor it and control it with an implant. They had something called a maser about the size of a grain of wheat. They'd drill it into the back of the brain, and they'd send the radio messages through the telephone wires. And it was direct control. It sounds like science fiction, but these are government documents that we have talking about. This guy Delgado was a fascist in Spain. He was trained there. He became famous for implanting one of these into a bull early on and having the bull charge him in a ring and pushing his button, and the bull stopped dead in his tracks. So that made him a famous scientist. And he thought, well, if you can control a bull while not a human. And he testified in 1972 to Congress about his view of the world. He wrote a book called Physical Control of the Brain Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society. And he said to Congress, why would people complain about an implant in their brain that would make them both happy and productive? He said, we could have armies in the field and labor in the fields, you know, armies in other countries and labor in the fields, all run by electronic remote control by a small technocracy, everybody happy. And that was his vision of a perfect world. I guess he would be at the instruments, not down on the field working, but privilege. The Office of Naval Intelligence and NASA thought enough of this fellow that they were funding him to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year to look into these implantations. They didn't treat him as, like, you know, a conspiracy nut. They treated him as somebody that had something that might work. They also developed plans in that period for a Center for the Study of Violent Behavior. And that was, these implants, when they were experimented with, also led to the situations described in Michael Crichton's earlier novel, Terminal Man. It was a Vietnam vet that had some violence. He hadn't been violent before, and he was beating up family members and throwing things, and he wanted to get it under control, and he went to the wrong psychiatrist. Marks and Sweet and Irvin in Boston were being funded through the CIA to experiment with the implantation of psychosurgery, so they put an implant in his brain. He got more violent. Broke up with his family, moved to the West Coast, got in barroom brawls all the time, was brought into the court regularly. Finally, one of the judges put him into a psychiatric institution, and he told the shrinks, they put this implant in my brain in Boston, and I haven't been the same since, it makes me violent. Oh, paranoid schizophrenic. They don't put implants in your brain to make it violent. That's all in your head. Well, it was in his head, all right. And it took months for them to get the records loose to find out that he wasn't lying. But they were testing these things out in Vacaville prison, doing the implantations, and in the VA system. And this Center for the Study of Violent Behavior had identified certain groups in the society that were inherently violent. You know, women, children, elderly, blacks, the violent people in the society. The ones that threaten everyone else. Lifton and West reappear at this time, the two brainwashing scientists. Lifton becomes an expert on veteran psychology and invents post-traumatic stress disorder as a way to give a psychiatric cover to the reaction of people to genocide. So we don't have to talk about the politics of the war, the reality of the war. It's all a personal problem the veteran is having. And in addition to that, Jocelyn West had done several years of work through the 60s and into the 70s at UCLA testing the LSD. He's infamous for having given too many micrograms of LSD to an elephant who dropped over dead with the dose. But he was testing humans as well, and still is. I got recent things up into the 90s at UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute for government funding for testing of LSD on human brains. Who knows what's the cover for? It's probably much more sophisticated, but that's what they list. The London Sunday Times revealed during the 1970s that war stress studies were being used as a cover, and Lifton is an expert on war stress, were being used as a cover internationally for experimentation with training assassins. And this person at one of the international conferences on war stress revealed a Clockwork Orange situation where at Army Letterman Hospital, a VA hospital in San Francisco, and at some hospitals in Italy the U.S. Army was using, they were clamping people's heads in a vise. They were forcing their eyes open with little clamps, and they're giving them drugs that made them feel like they were going through a near-death experience, or other drugs to inure them to violence. Then they would show them pictures of violent activity, people being castrated, children being burned alive over a pit, and they would ask, what's the color of the sky in this picture? What type of tree is that in the background? What sort of belt is the man wearing who's turning the spit? So that you disaffect yourself from what you're seeing and see other details in order to curb your emotional reaction. Once they had them trained to the, and they picked them by Rorschach test. If they had a violent, what they call a violent response to either end of the Rorschach, you know, these are the people most likely to be good killers, so they picked them out from the military prisons and psychiatric wards, and then took them into these experimentations and made them into killers. Then they would program them with a false history of the society they would be used in, racist ideology about the culture that they would be entering, and lies about the leadership that they were expected to kill. And so then they became trained or clockwork assassins, all of this done by U.S. intelligence and revealed, that was London Sunday Times, never made a U.S. paper, but they revealed this at one of the conferences. It's interesting, too, that the first two people asked to comment on the Jonestown mass suicide, both of whom said it was a normal human activity that had happened before in history, in the New York Times and the San Francisco Examiner, were none other than Robert J. Lifton and Jocelyn West, these two schemers. Sam Ervin, when he left the government, did a government report on, there's a report on the government role in individual behavior modification. And he lays out these groups that I talked to you about before that are the targets and how this is going to be done. And they almost set up an abandoned Nike missile base in California to do it before they had to give up on the plan. By the 1980s up to the present, Dr. Delgado was working on microwaves for control mechanisms. Dr. Lifton was covering up the role of Nazi doctors in a book that he wrote about Nazi doctors where he didn't name any of these killers, but gave them a cover of being good people who created a double that was able to do the bad things, so suddenly we had twice as many Nazis as before. And Dr. Jolly West moved into the Cult Awareness Network and was one of the major people promoting deprogramming of cult members into, of course, the new program that he's involved in. They always, though, play both sides, just as they distribute heroin worldwide and then control methadone, so that there are revolving doors in and out of the games that they play and involve people in. There have also been, during the 1980s and up till now, a proliferating number of mass murderers, shot killers that go into a situation like the McDonald's shooting, and lone nut assassins, too many of them with backgrounds as both veterans and as people that were tested in VA or overseas in the military with these various drugs. One example of that is the mass murder up in New York, although I doubt he did all the murders, but he's a convenient target, called Son of Sam, David Berkowitz. Mae Brussel, my fellow researcher, always called him Son of Uncle Sam. And I had an article in the Philadelphia papers I sent to her. A guy that was in his unit in Korea when he was a clerk said that he was a conscientious objector. In other words, he was opposed to war and killing and wanted to get out of the military. And he filed his papers as a conscientious objector. This is Berkowitz. And he said the brass gave him acid. Well, the brass, meaning the officers, don't give you acid when you say you're a conscientious objector. They might give you EA-1729 or whatever the MK-Ultra drug is, but in other words, the brass were giving Berkowitz drug manipulation from the time that he broke ranks in Korea in the 1950s. And so they move him up into the current period later, and he says, the devil told me to do it. There's also, I think, a proliferation of the New Age phenomena, channeling UFOs, the shamanist religions, which also, I think, is much of it used by the government as an apolitical situation, or a situation that people can derive profit from or be rich while they participate in. An example of that would be Jerry Rubin, who moves from supposedly being a yippie and opposed to the government to going into the New Age religions. Another example at the time was Rennie Davis, who got involved with Guru Maharaji and stopped talking about political opposition. I heard a nice interview recently with Jerry Rubin, not nice on his end, but a caller called up and said he'd gone on the streets in the 60s because of what he said. He'd gotten jailed many times and he better not see Rubin on the street. But all these guys, I think, were media phonies that were put up there as the leaders of a movement that had nothing really to do with it, and many of them actually had direct ties with U.S. intelligence. I'll tell you about Rennie Davis later. And then in addition to that, there developed a destruction syndrome of these groups that were identified by the government as cults, to frighten off people from alternative things, a sort of exorcist approach. The guy that wrote the book, Exorcist, was actually for 8 years the head of all psychological operations in Vietnam, a Jesuit by the name of William P. Blatty. And so he's a mind control expert anyway, and he does this book, The Exorcist, to frighten everybody back into the good white Christian church, because otherwise the devil will get you. And then they do subliminal programming in the movie. Remember, people were going out throwing up and that kind of stuff because they were programming people to be frightened even beyond what the movie would do, and sending certain messages. So I think they're sending out basically liminal and subliminal messages in the movies and in the general thing to get you back to fearing the great white Father God, and also fearing each other. And now I think fearing your children is part of the theme in movies, where the children are now turning into demons and attacking the parents. And so, but movies are owned and operated by these same rich people. The board of 20th Century Fox for some period of time had Madame New, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig. These are the people making movies for you. So, I mean, I'm sure it's because they're good critics. These cults, then, that proliferate are both infiltrated and used for information and for other purposes. They're created whole cloth, or they're taken over. And I'm sorry if my intro took me a little while, but I wanted to give you a background of how I think governments moved into this area and why. The religious cults, which would be one whole area, to give some examples, the Catholic Church has an evangelical movement now, and they do what's called shepherding. And people give over their lives everywhere they go, and entertainment, what they eat, is given to a spiritual mentor under this movement. And these are strict line reactionary Catholics. The women in the families that participate are called handmaidens. I don't know how many of you have read Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, the feminist about a theocratic state takeover. And one of the leaders in this movement is the guy that owns and operates Domino's Pizza, which is one of the main funders also for stopping abortions and the anti-abortion movement in the United States. He's one of these evangelical shepherded people, but the Protestants have evangelical shepherds also, but it's basically a control system. The Hare Krishnas were given at various points police protection for criminal activity and direct CIA and FBI funding at the top levels in order to divert a certain segment, I believe, of the community from political activity. Guru Maharaji, the fat little guru, the 12-year-old kid that went around in his limousines and showed you how you can be spiritual and spend money at the same time, was taken up as a cause by Rennie Davis. Switching from politics to religion became the theme of the period after COINTELPRO, and abandoning certain political activity. Rennie Davis grew up in Virginia. I grew up in Virginia, but he's a little bit south of me in a place called Bluemont, up in the mountains in Virginia, in southern Virginia, in the Shenandoah. And the actual farm that his father owned that he grew up on is the location of one of 8 command and control centers for nuclear war. And it's right on his land. A plane crashed into the mountainside, killing a lot of military intelligence agents in the 70s. And FBI and military intelligence sprang up from all over to protect this place. My mother called it the Little Pentagon. She'd been in there. It's an underground facility. These things are built 2 miles into the earth in mountains to protect them for nuclear war. And they have a list that we got out under Freedom of Information Act in the 70s of who's supposed to go into them. It's 160 people that are listed under 24-hour intelligence surveillance, and they grab these people when there's a nuclear attack and they move them to these little centers, the closest one by military transportation. And most of them were like president, vice president, chiefs of staff, certain cabinet positions. It wasn't by name, but there were some names on there. One of the most interesting one to me, one of the earliest liars about the Kennedy assassination, is Dan Rather. I don't think he's going to go down in there to give us, the sundown report on nuclear war. I think it's because it's important to the government. They don't pay you $1 million unless you read whatever's put in front of you. And, he's just in there for the haul, but he's got his reward. He gets to go down the hole. Interesting to me was that all the positions, unless something drastically changed in society, all those positions and all the people named were going to be male. So either they perfected cloning technology and they're going to use Kissinger's nose and everybody will be a little, but they seem to have forgotten an element there. Maybe they're not going to come back up. They're just going to have fun. Or maybe, you go down and then when you finish you get off the planet, alternative 3. Evangelical and right-wing and missionary organizations exist back for a long time, but in the current period they operate under the Federation of Evangelist Ministries out of Evanston, Illinois, which is basically a town owned by them. And they've been part of many overt and covert political agendas. Send the missionaries in first, switch the Bibles for the land, bring the government in next is an old story. But there were, and they currently favor an end to church-state separation. They talk about a theocratic state and an end to democracy. They do this openly. They believe in self-salvation, only a personal relation to God, forget everybody else, and also self-damnation within that sequence. If you haven't got that personal relation, you deserve to die. And they're even gleeful, like Pat Robertson's program. They get on there and say, there's going to be a nuclear war. And then all the Christians go to heaven, the rest of us go someplace else. It's hot. And Robertson, we should remember, doesn't just come out of nowhere. He worked for the Grace family for many, many years when they took over the country of Peru, essentially economic. He was their front man, their hatchet man in Peru. And Grace family, among other things, founded the AIFLD, American Institute for Free Labor Development, the major CIA arm for crushing labor unions all around the world. Another one that I did some work on in that circle that I think is very dangerous is known as the Full Gospel Christian Businessmen's Association. And they do conversions. They also do prayer breakfasts. They're women's auxiliary. I guess they're not full gospel women, sort of half gospel. But they're the auxiliary women to the full gospel. They do prayer breakfasts at the White House and at the Pentagon, so they can come in and pray before they do whatever they're doing there. They also claim to have converted Rios Montt, the genocidal leader of Guatemala, when he came into office, and they claim to have converted Forbes Burnham, the president of Guyana, on the evening before the Jonestown massacre. He found Christ. So they have a lot of conversions. In the Kennedy assassination, there was the international missionary group headed up by Albert Osborne and J. Howard Bowen, which was actually a cover in Mexico for the training of the assassins. It was a military camp under the cover of missionary operation. These people were tied with Carl McIntyre, American Council, later International Council of Christian Churches, and his discovery in Australia, Mr. Fred Schwartz, who runs the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade. But these are all people that mix together religion and politics. And then there are political organizations and cults who pose on the front as religious groups for recruitment and civil rights purposes, but in fact are nothing more than an extension of this reactionary and genocidal and racist religious view. A major one of those that I think is worth studying, I've done some on, is World Vision. It was formed in the 1950s to work with refugees fleeing communist tyranny. That was a line in their little magazine, which makes them a recruiting ground for anti-communist elements. Like when the people fled Cuba and came into the United States, mostly the rich and the disenfranchised, and settled in Miami, they became an instant community for recruitment by the CIA. They were given jobs with Polizzi Construction Company, the mobs out of Cleveland that worked with CIA, down there in Miami. They built shopping centers, then they were given jobs in the stores and store ownerships, and they were maintained as an active force for CIA operations and assassinations all through that period up to the current time. One example of that is the Watergate testimony of Bernard Barker, who was involved with the Bay of Pigs. He said, well, who did you use, Mr. Barker? How did you know Eugenio Martinez and these other people, Cubans that broke into the Watergate with you? He said, well, they were my boys, my team. He said, what do you mean your team? For what? He said, well, for the Bay of Pigs. He said, well, how long had it been since you had contact with these people? He said, about 20 years. They said, how long did it take you to locate them? He said, 10 minutes. He said, they're on call. They're part of a standing mercenary army, and they did the same with many of the Vietnamese and Thai refugees that came into the country. But World Vision is the point of first contact and recruitment for these people, and they're also recruitable because they're disenfranchised, dislocated as assassins. They have jobs for them. Under the cover of Christian charity, World Vision goes all over the world, but in fact, during the Vietnam War, more than 15% of their funding was directly and openly CIA. And they were doing open spying for the CIA in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under their missionary work cover, and they were given direct military intelligence support. In other words, they could travel in army trucks to where they were going to do their missionary work. We find them later at Sabra and Shatila, the refugee camps for the Palestinians that are attacked by the fascist Phalange. World Vision is running those camps at the time of the attack and do nothing to protect the people that are being killed. They run the camps along the Honduras border, where the Contras are recruited by the CIA. They run camps in the United States for Cuban and Haitian refugees, in Florida and in Pennsylvania. And at those two sites, if you remember, riots broke out. Part of the reason for those riots was that the actual operation, day-to-day operation of the camp was left over to Alpha 66 and Omega 7, the two killing teams from the Bay of Pigs and part of the Cuban reactionaries. They came in and did political education, but if you didn't take the political education class about why you should join them and fight Castro and overthrow Cuba, you didn't eat, and in some cases you got beaten. And so people reacted to this education they were getting at World Vision's behest. They also ran operations at Fort Chaffee, and at that military base they had Thai refugees, and one of the main people working with World Vision out there was Mark David Chapman, the man who later shows up in New York to shoot John Lennon before he can go out and stop the Reagan militarization program, a person that could have brought 1 million people into the street. Their Guatemalan water project and eventually chairmanship of their board was done by a person by the name of John W. Hinckley Sr., the father of the person that takes the shot at Reagan. Misses, but he's there for the pop gun. I don't mean misses killing him, I mean misses him altogether. Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his Unification Church actually date back to the founding conference which they sponsored for something known as the World Anti-Communist League. This was the conglomeration of all the white Russian, Nazi, proto-fascist, and other fascist elements within the world society and out of different countries combining together. Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean would be one of those, or Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations. These very reactionary, pro-monarchist in some cases, definitely anti-democracy groups. This is their gathering organization, and its founding conference was put on by Reverend Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church. And they're little more than a veneer to recruit people into that. They're opposed to communism. They have a racist ideology that says that blacks are put on the planet to do menial labor. They're a pro-fascist organization. They recruit directly out of the United States into the Korean Army. People are recruited here into the church and end up in Korean Army uniforms on the front lines. People are told they have to fight a holy war against communism in the future, led by the Reverend Moon. His chauffeur and top right-hand man for many of the early years was Bo-hee Pak, the director of Korean CIA, which is no different than our CIA in Korea, and was the source of the channeled funds to bribe Congress in the Koreagate scandal. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, the Church Holy and Triumphant, is another World Anti-Communist League sponsored organization. I went to one of the lectures and picked up the handbill, and on the back are the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, the Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean. All the member groups of WACO are supporting the talk by this person who's a survivalist, arcane and manipulative religion or revisionist history, some occult history they rely on, but basically a control scenario, and pumping out anti-communist ideology along with it. Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard, who I mentioned earlier, worked for Office of Naval Intelligence in World War II, infiltrating other cult organizations, formed his own, then in the 1950s, a science fiction writer. It uses something called the E-meter for control, basically like a galvanic skin response meter device that can tell on a real crude level whether you're lying or not. And in order to get in, you go through a confession sequence on this E-meter, and then they use it later on for loyalty tests. The inner circle moves up to something called the Sea Org, or a special place in Britain that they have a certain operation there for the elite. And they took directly, Sea Org did CIA-funded jobs worldwide. I talked to veterans who told me that all the radio operators and communication men in the U.S. secret war in Laos were also Scientologists. They have a phony opposition to psychiatry because they want to replace psychiatrists with the E-meter and do the control themselves, and they have this Citizens Commission on Human Rights. But when they intersect with the real anti-psychiatry movement of the ex-inmates and the people who have been victimized by psychiatry, they don't want to let them into Scientology. They don't want those people. They're willing to use their political stuff in order to pull people over to them. And Hubbard would have this operating Thetan level that would go up every once in a while. As soon as everybody paid to be level 7, then there was suddenly a level 8. And they actually had these like cosmetic sales slaves that were working through Scientology-owned cosmetic firms, selling door-to-door cosmetics to get enough money to be at their next operating Thetan level. I guess you operate pretty well. You have to sell stuff for them. Freedom, finally. So it was financial slavery. Another example of their hypocrisy is that Paulette Cooper, the woman that wrote Scandal Scientology, one of the few books exposing Scientology years ago, was approached by them. They called it Operation Mindfuck. And they got two people to stage a fight outside of her apartment, one attacking her, the other saving her, befriended her to the person that saved her, who was a Scientologist, who got into her apartment and began to do things to make her think that she was crazy so that they could get her locked up in a psychiatric ward because they opposed psychiatry. Freemasonry is also used as a cover, especially the British and Monaco lodges were a cover for Propaganda Due, a fascist cell in Italy, the P2 internationally, and Flavio, the Sword. These things are just coming out now. These are like long-term political secret societies that pulled the strings within the Italian government, ran the government so that communism could never take over and fascism stayed in place. The first Pope, John Paul, actually tried to rid the Catholic Church of these Masonic elements, and he died about 30 days after he went in. I think was murdered. There's several books out about his death that show that it was suspicious. And when the next one came in, there was, if you remember, a shooting attempt on the Pope. This was by this guy Mehmet Ali Agha, and he was portrayed by these right-wing ideologues as some kind of Bulgarian KGB agent, but in fact, his whole political life was with the Grey Wolves, a pro-fascist group in Turkey, and he was proto-fascist. And as soon as the Pope got shot, he decided that Opus Dei should no longer be a lay order, and he elevated it to a religious order in the church. So I guess he could smell which way the bullets were coming from. And another example of this would be the Temple of Set, which broke off as a schism from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan and was organized primarily first in Vietnam among the intelligence and death squads and the Phoenix program squads in Vietnam as a satanic religion by an intelligence agent named Michael Aquino. And in later years, Aquino continued the Temple of Set and initiated NATO officers to Nazi black mass rituals in Goering's castle, and did some of the things that they had, places they had gone to hold black mass rituals. He recreated them for these top NATO generals. He's a top-level military intelligence operative. He was implicated in the child abuse that went on at Presidio base out in San Francisco. He was merely transferred by the U.S. military, and he remains untouched. He sent a death threat to Mae Brussel about a month before her demise that I found in the records that she had, and told her to shut up about him, but she was starting to expose Aquino and his operation. And also, I believe, EST, which was not initially called Earhart Systems Training, but was called Eureka Scientology Transcendental Meditation. If you go back far enough, Eureka is a religion in Chile that's studied and practiced by the fascists under Pinochet. It's the fascist religion in Chile, and this was part of what this and the control system Scientology that he based his operation on. Political cults also exist that operate in similar fashion. Lyndon LaRouche and his various names for organizations, I won't go into all of them, but he has about 16 different ones over time and keeps putting out different versions of history and reclaiming them, putting out new ones. But he dates back to an Army intelligence background. Early on when I was tracking him, there was evidence, direct evidence of Rockefeller funding, that his organizational bank account was in a Rockefeller Chase Manhattan Bank up in New York, and he would get sudden deposits of $500,000 into the account without any explanation. And his troops at that time were bragging, because I guess this is what he told them to explain how they were getting money. They sure as hell weren't getting it selling New Solidarity, which you couldn't even read on the street, but they wanted you to believe that. And they didn't have the DuPont fortune yet then. So this is early on in LaRouche's history. He was getting these huge sums of money. And his followers told me that he was such a brilliant computer scientist that he was tapping into the computers at Chase Manhattan and getting little deposits in his account. And I said, first of all, I don't believe it, but if I did believe it, and you could get into Chase Manhattan computers, you wouldn't screw around with 500,000. Not unless you're awfully stupid. So he was getting Rockefeller funding, and he had a clear shift from supposedly being leftist in his ideology to turning to the right. In those days, as a leftist, he was running Operation Mop-Up, which went after other legitimate left groups, although they might have been misguided, or vanguard groups. They were at least, not intelligence creations, and small left sects in New York. And he had his people go out and attack them with knucks and brick bats and beat them senseless and hospitalize them, and no police reaction at all to what he was doing, because I think he was doing it for them. He was providing guns in the black community, running guns in the black community and telling people that they should riot and start a revolution in the black community, which I think was provocateur activity on his part. And he was attacking all of his political enemies in the most vile sort of psychosexual language. He had a paper that I found early on in the New York organizing called The Sexual Impotence of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. And he commonly referred to his political enemies as pimps, whores, talked about their sexual activities with their mothers. And this guy was really foul, so they've cleaned up his act a little bit, not much, but now he's just incomprehensible. But they had a disinformation campaign that they've continued, and they put out some good information mixed in with a lot of lies and disinformation, and they maintained both left and right-wing fronts under the LaRouche aegis. One of those I've discovered is something called Marxist Cadre in New York, which also doubles as the Assassination Information Center in New York and San Francisco. This is not the Dallas AIC. This dates back into the 70s. Run in New York by Dupperman, and in San Francisco by a person named Kangas, Paul Kangas. They write these long tracts about CIA being behind the assassinations, but they mix it with all this Marxist rhetoric, and it's basically senseless. In fact, I saw one of these things up about the shooting of Lenin by the CIA, and somebody in New York typically had written on it, why don't you give me a dime, buddy, so I can call someone who gives a shit. But they did programming in the early years with Beethoven, which I'm sure had subliminally, you have to sit for 3 hours and listen to Beethoven, then you have to sit for about 6 hours without going to the bathroom and listen to LaRouche. There was violence and harassment, both the external enemies and the disloyal members. And now they're very close to key people in the Reagan and Bush teams. They want to return the Nazi rocket scientists that have been booted out of this country as war criminals in order to start a program to colonize the moon and Mars. And so they're petitioning for us not to be so mean to these rocket scientists. After all, they helped us with the Saturn rocket. Why shouldn't we respect them? Never mind, they killed 6 million to do it. That's worth getting 2 on the moon. They have ties to the KKK and the far right wing, and they're an intelligence source on left and progressive groups for the police and the CIA. They also even had a New Age operation called Cosmic Connection, which was supposed to be a channel of Buddha and Christ and the light, and when the channel came through, it told you to read LaRouche publications. And I found one sheet from them that was a cover-up on the Jonestown operation. At one time, affiliated group was headed up by Dr. Fred Newman. He had early ties to the LaRouche group after they went rightward, although he claims to be a leftist and unconnected now. The first I saw of Newman was at a CIA-financed conference in Atlanta. When the CIA was kicked out of the National Student Association, they formed the National Association of Student Governments, NASG, and he was one of the keynote speakers there. He now runs something called the New Alliance Party, although they really should be called the No Alliance Party, because they have no connection, as in the case with LaRouche and these other, with any existing group. They're cults of personality built around a few people, and he uses a form of psychological manipulation under the cover of being some advanced Marxist Freudian therapy as part of his political work. And we talked to one of the people under their control, and basically the person who's sending you out to do the tasks is also your shrink. And so if you act up or rebel against what you're being told to do, then you have to come in for sessions to clean you out of your bourgeois ideology and your psychological problems that you're having. So it's a nice little circle that they've set up. Another group, at least in the past, called itself Eastern Service Workers Association or Western Service Workers Association on the West Coast. I don't know if you've heard of them. They were fairly small. They had an inner group that remained nameless. They called it the Committee That Dare Not Speak Its Name. And they collected information on 3x5 cards on people on the street and other political activities. They were diverting funds and false projects. They had to be sued in Philadelphia for running around with cans all over the place. They had these people with cans collecting day in and day out. They said they were doing a battered women's shelter, when in fact the real battered women's shelter couldn't get any money. And they weren't doing anything. They said, well, it's part of a 5-year plan. We don't have it yet. And they would have, after you did your work on the street for them long enough to trust you, they sent you to a special weekend training, sort of like the EST training, where they take your car keys away and lock you in. They had these guards in black uniforms and guns, and you'd be screamed at by this person in the inner circle. If you could put up with that for a weekend, then you could move into the more inner circles of this organization. But it was supposedly doing political work in the street and was being run like a cult at the top. Another one I want to talk about briefly are UFO organizations that fall somewhere between political and religious, especially the contactee and abduction sequences. And to give a little background, I was fascinated when I was 10 to 12 years old with UFOs. I believed in extraterrestrial visitation at that point. I thought people were coming from outer space. I wanted to find out everything I could, and I subscribed to magazines that existed back then in the late 50s and early 60s, like Flying Saucer magazine. There were all these little publications that you could get for 10 or 12 bucks for a year, and they'd come out and report on things. I also had access, because of my mother, to the Pentagon Library. So I had Blue Book and Grudge and Twinkle and all the Air Force reports, and something that came out then and stopped in the 60s called World UFO Report, which was just a listing of all the sightings, where they happened, what azimuth, what they were like, all around the world. And it came out in an annual compilation. I was also fascinated with the books of George Adamski. And I made my parents drag me up to a lecture of Adamski, who claimed to have gotten on a flying saucer and gone to Mars. And a 10-year-old kid, I wanted to ask him what kind of animals were on Mars and sorts of things. But when I got there, I was sharp enough to understand that he was lying. I went believing in the guy, and he made such a protestation about government cover-up and all this stuff that it didn't sit with me correctly. And I began to distrust him. And also, the Pentagon research kept telling me that these were terrestrial craft. All the reports in the World Report were in the vicinity of or seen coming into or going out of military bases. And then there was another strata that were going in and out of water. But they were all connected or flying around military bases. And I also had one other experience that was important. When I was about 5, I saw a UFO above my grandmother's house. When I was a kid, I didn't know what a UFO was then. I mean, you know, this was the early 50s, 5 years old. It hadn't been, you know, anything, didn't mean anything to me, but I saw a craft, disc-shaped craft, about 30 feet in diameter over her house, and I saw someone sitting at the controls with a human face. And I remember running in to get her, and by that time it was flying way off and could barely see it, so it went fast, but I had seen a human pilot, and I saw, well, way back in the early 60s, a human rocket thing, like they have in that one James Bond film, the guy with the little command, and he flies up in his own jet propulsion and flies over these things and comes back down. So they were testing weird stuff at the Pentagon when I was little that nobody had any idea was anything except, you know, Buck Rogers. You know, they would be flying it around there. That was even public. Who knows what they were doing elsewhere. And I came to believe that these were terrestrial craft and were part of a general pattern of hidden technology within the society that they wouldn't tell you about. Also, the little magazines dried up in the early 60s and were replaced by official publications and organizations, one of the biggest ones called NICAP. And the people who took over NICAP were people like Major General Donald Kehoe, Air Force intelligence people. And they weren't independent little researchers, they were people from the Air Force intelligence, and they were all coming out saying the government's lying, there's flying saucers, you know, and they come from Mars, and you know, they're covering it all up. But it was all intelligence people that took over the field. Hynek came in, and they worked out of Wright-Patterson at this Building 8, which was the headquarters out there for Air Force intelligence. It's the building where the frozen Martians are supposed to be kept. And it's a high security building, but they do a great deal out. And one book you should read about that, people in that building, is called Air Force Mafia by Peter James, about these Air Force intelligence scams to get kickbacks on new technology when they would discover it overseas. They'd bring the technology back to a corporation, it would then sell it to the government, and then they'd get a kickback from the corporation instead of bringing it to the government first. You see, so that was one of the operations of these people. The same people then, same personnel, would have been working on Blue Book and Grudge and Twinkle. I later discovered in my work that the British, for instance, at the end of World War II, by 1945, had tens of thousands of remotely piloted vehicles in the sky doing different reconnaissance and other tasks. There were reports of Nazis having something called foo balls, or FEU, the French word for fireballs, or FOO is the common anglicization, foo balls, in the air that would go up near the B-52s and knock out their directional patterns and cause them, the engines to go on and stop, and cause some of the B-52s to go down or crash or have trouble flying, and all they could see was this sort of spherical ball of fire, or several of them coming around the plane. Didn't know what they were. There's numerous reports of that. I also found evidence that there were rocket scientists, one of the main ones, Dr. Meathen, working in different parts of Germany at the end of the war on functional saucers, on disc-shaped flying craft, manned and unmanned, that could go at tremendous speeds and you know, had airfoil differences. And then I got reports also of GIs who said that they went into caves outside of Germany, outside of Berlin, in the area, because the Nazis didn't want their aerospace stuff bombed, so they would take it down into a subterranean cave and do all their aerospace work there. And when they took over, they went looking for these technicians. They went down into these caves where the aerospace stuff was, and they said that there were both functional jets and flying saucers, or these disc-shaped crafts there when they got there in 45, 46. So I think that this technology was Nazi technology that was brought forward. In the early years of satellite reconnaissance, it could help see below cloud cover or over horizon for satellite enhancement. And Jacques Vallée, the scientist who's done a great deal of work on UFOs and quit Blue Book because he said it was a phony investigation, used a scientific approach, says that the UFO community is divided between what he calls Republicans and Democrats. Either you have to believe it's swamp gas or you have to believe it's men from Mars. And I think it's instead a manipulated terrestrial phenomena, hidden agendas, and the contactees really come from military intelligence. Vallée talks about people who first see black helicopters and U.S. military vans or trucks, then they see UFOs, and then they have an abduction sequence. And he talks about what he calls psychotronics, that some way an electronic imagery is being implanted by the military to create UFO interactions. So I call them UFOs unrecognized fascist observatories. And William S. Burroughs said that if this was the Middle Ages and Magellan was an American and he sailed around the planet and found out it was round instead of flat, we wouldn't tell anybody so we could attack from the rear. So that's why you have hidden technology, because it's hidden weaponry, it's hidden, you know, it's spycraft and other stuff. And I think there's a tremendous amount of disinformation going on in manipulation. I believe that subliminal images, televisions primarily, are being used in order to create images in the mind of abduction sequences. And that's why I think people are able to recall these abductions. And so somebody like this guy Whitley Strieber, who goes out and writes this book, says, boy, I had this strange experience, and these Martians came to my house, they took me up a flying saucer. Did you have anything like that? He's the vacuum cleaner. He's finding out who's picking up the subliminal message strong enough that they remember. Do you remember in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie, the way that people gather is they all see images of Devil's Mountain, and then they all come together, and Vallee's, the scientist, trying to figure out why did all these people come. They have a subliminal image. So I think that's why there's a similarity in the various, and the hypnosis, I think, is a bad way to draw it out, but that's why there's because hypnosis is very suggestive and not reliable, but I think that's why you have a similarity, is because they're sending it as a subliminal message and then, of the abduction, and then using it. And I think there's people actively involved in disinformation in the field, many of whom, it turns out, have military backgrounds. One of those is Office of Naval Intelligence operative William Cooper. Behold a Pale Horse, or as one person told me, he wrote a paper on that called Behold a Pale Horse Shit. But Cooper says that the whole conductors that came in, and there's two kinds, there's a gray and a green, I think, and then they took over, but in exchange for human bodies to manipulate and work on and experiment on, then they give their hidden technology, their saucer or other advanced technology, to the government. And it's all a deal that was cut by the government. And he even says that that's why Kennedy was assassinated, because Kennedy was going to tell us about the aliens and the underground military bases that were in the country, so they had to shoot him. And then he says that the driver turned around and shot him from the front seat. That doesn't match any of the physical evidence. And he shows this old grainy copy of the Zapruder film, so you'll think a shadow is a gun. And he says, there it is, you know, and everybody sees the gun. And so the driver shoots Kennedy. And he went so far in Santa Cruz when he showed it, he had a rent-a-cop come in and arrest him for showing this illegal film to make it more credible. But he goes around, you know, with this thing. And I said, yeah, he's right. There were aliens that took over the government in the 1950s. They're German nationals. And they're gray and green because those are the uniforms they wore. And the little green men in the spacecraft are wearing army uniforms. Well, probably now it's camouflage men from Mars. Another one that I just picked up links the UFO and the secret society stuff into a theory. This is this guy Bramley, who does Gods of Eden. It's basically a disinformation text. And then, to give you an example of one of these UFO cults that I looked at, this astronaut, Armstrong, runs it, and it's out in the deserts in the United States, and the cultists go out, and they're going to have a contact with the UFO, and they sit, and they chant, and they meditate, and they try to get the UFO to come, and lo and behold, the UFO comes, which I think it could, of course, because it's just from a local military base, send it out, and they see the UFO. And then one of the people who visits him regularly and supports this is General Singlaub, who's the American president of the World Anti-Communist League. And one of the things that they do after they've met the Space Brothers and made contact is they pray to the Space Brothers to kill the premier of Russia. This was before the fall of communism. So this is, you know, UFO training that they're getting. Does it mean that I don't think the UFOs are possible? That it's impossible there's life anywhere else in the universe? No. But I'll say this. I think that if you're smart enough to get out of your gravity well in any numbers, and you're smart enough to live for a long enough time to travel interstellar to get to another planet that has life, and you're that smart, you get here, you're smart enough to turn around. I'd get out of the gravity well if I could, or maybe come to Maui. Kenneth Arnold is the first person to have seen the flying saucers in 1947. A pilot in Washington State saw these flying discs over Mount Rainier in that area. Just happens that his co-pilot in the plane who wasn't with him that day is Jack Parsons, one of the 3 Navy intelligence guys who infiltrated cults in the 40s. The second major sighting in the newspapers, first close contact in 1947, also in Washington State, is a guy named Fred Lee Chrisman. He happens to be identified by a number of the JFK researchers as one of the Dealey Plaza tramps that's arrested after the shooting of JFK. Fred Lee Chrisman also had close ties with Carl McIntyre and the American Council of Christian Churches. So these are the first 2 people to see flying saucers and began the extraterrestrial mythology. Then, in addition to these existing organizations that I think are used, there are government creations, infiltrations, and takeovers. One example of that on the political scale is the SLA. I wrote an article about them, Symbionese Liberation Army that kidnapped Patty Hearst, opera for the rich. And I wrote an article about them back at the time called Cheese It, It's the Cops, because I did background work in Indiana on William and Emily Harris and Angela Atwood, or Angela D'Angelique, 3 of the top members of the SLA. And it turned out that they were Indiana Mod Squad narcotics bust team for the Indiana State Police. They were cops. They didn't have a radical background. They didn't believe anything revolutionary. They didn't have a picture of Huey Newton up on the wall. But they go out to California and suddenly they're part of pick up the gun and smash the state. Well, you don't go from being a cop to being that, overnight. It's a political development. Even if you think a cop might turn around and think that way, these guys, within a month, go out there, they get a government-financed job at the universities, and then they're spouting all this rhetoric. Their symbol is a 7-headed cobra, which was the symbol for the Phoenix assassination squads in Vietnam. Directly taken from that. They did early recruitment for the 2 years prior in the U.S. prisons. In the federal prisons, they recruited membership for the SLA with a promise to the prisoners, and we've talked to these people, that they would get out of prison if they would join the SLA. Okay? I mean, you can't do that separate from the prison system of the government. The point was to discredit the left and progressive groups and make people look violent and senseless. These cops go in there. Every single person in the Peking house, the original group the SLA grew out of, had intelligence ties. A book was written 2 years ahead of time describing the kidnapping called Black Abductors, written as a pornography by a non-existent publishing house that had this black radical group kidnap the daughter of a West Coast publishing figure. Part of this was a long-time war between the Rockefellers and the Hearsts. This is why Patty became the victim. Colston Westbrook, who ran the Peking house and did the early recruitment for the SLA, was part of Pacific Engineering, a CIA subsidiary in Vietnam, and also worked with the Phoenix program. Theodore Wheeler and Field Marshal Sing Q, Donald DeFreeze, were both UCLA, LA police informants and provocateurs. Another group that was created under this 7-headed cobra symbol at the time was US, or Us, or United Slaves by Ron Karenga. And the 7-headed cobra became the 7 principles that they have for the Christmas time celebration. I'm not remembering the name of it right now, but there's a whole religion built around these 7 principles. Came out of this 7-headed cobra thing. Karenga made them up. COINTELPRO, it was part of that, and Karenga and United Slaves participated in gunfights, murdering Panthers as part of the government operations against the Black Panthers. Another one set up from the beginning to discredit the counterculture was the so-called Manson family. Manson was released from prison. All the vans he stole, all the credit cards that he took, was never challenged by anybody when he became public. Went up and down the coast and got all these things without any money, fresh out of prison, were taken from, and the women that went with him were taken from the families of top-ranking military intelligence agents in California. These were throwaway kids and throwaway money that they were willing to let him have and take out in the desert with him and mess with them with the drugs. He whispered to Leary when they were in Folsom Prison together and cell next to cell, he said, you've taken acid, why don't you use it to control people? Well, acid doesn't control people. You don't give somebody a dose of pure LSD and then tell them what to do. It's not a controlled drug. So whatever acid he was getting was something else. He might have thought it was acid and he gave it to the women and then they would do what he said. But this was the MK Ultra drugs. And the person who supplied all the drugs to the Manson family, 2 weeks after the Tate killing, cut his hair, put his shoes back on, and went back to work at the Defense Language Institute of Naval Intelligence in Monterey, California. This guy had been an intelligence operative the whole time, that he was supplying all the drugs to the situation down there and testing it with people. But it was a way to make people think that if you tried to live alternatively with a hippie, you're going to take acid and stick forks in people's stomachs. And so we should leave that alone. Altamont also was set up by the military intelligence to counter Woodstock, to show the dark side of the coin. The Altamont Conference with the Stones playing Sympathy to the Devil while the Hells Angels beat someone to death. The Hells Angels themselves, disaffected Korean and World War II veterans and Vietnam veterans, formed the Hells Angels. They were used by the FBI as killers. They were contracted out to kill Cesar Chavez at one point. And they were mules for drug delivery for the U.S. intelligence agencies. And immediately after Altamont, the Stones were taken for legal counsel. F. Lee Bailey, who covered up on many intelligence operations, F. Lee Bailey takes them in a plane, and they go to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to the headquarters of the Defense Industrial Security Command. So they have the Stones out there to work out their legal strategy at the major center of military police operations in the United States, and DISC was one of the agencies directly involved with planning the murder of John F. Kennedy. The MOVE situation, I was in Philadelphia in '78 and again in the '80s. When they first attacked MOVE, they surrounded them. They created a fascist neighborhood. They put up a fence. They had a zebra ID. You had to have an ID to go in and out of the neighborhood or take a friend in. They had SWAT teams. They had 24-hour surveillance. Before they set up the whole shebang, I got to them with a copy of Vigilante magazine, which is sent by the far right wing to police departments in the United States, which identified them in the magazine, had pictures of their little house there in Philadelphia in a mixed community, and it said they were an urban terrorist group and the police had to wipe them out. Then Mayor Rizzo said get out or die to make the election, and he had these fascist stormtroopers in the police department, these SWAT teams surround them. And it was the SWAT teams who shot the cop, Mr. Ramp, and made a big issue that they'd killed a cop. He was shot from behind and up above him while he was running the hose in. He was 56 years old, about to retire and get his pension. A desk sergeant they put at the front of the hose to run in on this group with a couple of guns. And then they arrest all the members for murder and put them all in jail. They don't even do any ballistics. And in fact, you couldn't do any ballistics because they bulldozed the house within 42 hours. They razed the house to the ground with a special police demolition team, never heard of before or since. Bulldozers come in and all the evidence is gone, so you can't do ballistic work on. But there was one TV reporter who snuck into an empty house in the neighborhood and actually filmed them dragging unarmed Delbert Africa out of the basement and dealing with him about the same way you saw them deal with Rodney King later in Los Angeles, just beating him senseless. And the MOVE organization was isolatable. They were radical. Some of them had been former Black Panthers. They didn't believe in the system. They were alienated. They wanted to live in a natural way. They didn't do sewage. They didn't kill animals. They had rats. But when the police surrounded them, the Powelton community came out in force in the streets with signs that said "Cats, not cops," to deal with the rat problem. But they didn't want the police presence in the neighborhood to deal with this sort of obstreperous group. Instead, a lot of them were jailed. The few that survived moved on, finally found another house in another section of Philadelphia, were singled out later when Mayor Good came in, but the cops that actually attacked them were from the same unit that did the attack in '78. The same cops carry over because they hadn't cleaned out Rizzo's troops, and they go in and they drop an incendiary device, they call it an entry device, on this new house, saying they can't get into it because it's got a bunker in there, and they're very well armed. They hardly fire any shots. All the shots come in from the police, similar to the SLA burnout, where you have 4,000 rounds going into the house and the neighbor's house, and 20 or 30 rounds coming out. You're told that they have some grand arsenal, but then you have to believe that the police haven't just raided the weapons room to show it to you, with this grand arsenal that they caught. Well, imagine what they could have done. They could have acted like the police. And so they go in and set the house on fire. Well, we found out that for 6 months at a local Army base, they'd been taking helicopters over with these police in them and dropping C4, which is it's an explosive that you're not supposed to have any civilian use for. It's only a military weapon. It's like carrying around a bomb, from the military, this C4 explosive, and they were dropping it on a test house to see if they could blow it up or set it on fire the way they finally did there in the neighborhood. And when they set it on fire, even though they have fire trucks that can shoot all the way across the street, this huge stream of water, they said that the firemen had to be protected, so they couldn't come out and put the fire out because they'd be fired on by the MOVE people burning to death inside. And so there was no water put on the house, and then eventually the whole neighborhood burned down. about 60 houses burned because they wouldn't throw any water in the fire for fear that, if any of this is starting to sound familiar with recent events, it's not my fault. But they couldn't let any fire trucks do their job, and so they burnt down half the black neighborhood, the working class neighborhood there in Philadelphia. They're still rebuilding it, and they fooled Wilson Good, this black mayor that came in. They sent him out of town. He was down at John Warner's ranch in Virginia. Warner, part of the military-industrial spy complex himself, a longtime supporter, and he had to rush back to Philadelphia to deal with the situation. And he had given the green light on the basis of what the police told him. They didn't tell him they were going to use an incendiary device. They were just going to surround the people and try and get them out. So it's very similar to the position that Clinton and Janet Reno have been put in this Waco situation, where they give the green light to a little tear gas, little knowing what the military and the feds are actually planning, and then they're stuck with the responsibility. All of this is part and parcel of a vast militarization of police and a breakdown in the traditional division between police and military functions in society that's going on. Really broken down since it was established at the Revolutionary period, but especially in the more recent period. I mean, they had tanks at the door at Waco, military tanks. They had not National Guard in the LA riots. They had 300 actual Army troops. Now, this is a violation of the Constitution, but as long as they can put it in front of you and tell you it's an emergency, then you're not going to notice as they erode the difference. They let the military now function as drug cops. Well, see, all of this, that's what Schutzstaffel meant. The SS was the military police in Nazi Germany. That's why they were so dreaded. Because when you combine those two functions, that's what creates a fascist state and the preconditions for a military coup. So this is all part of an ongoing militarization of police and police operations. Jonestown was another example, I think, of an entirely created situation. Jim Jones had connections with the CIA. He was a boyhood friend. His mentor when he was young was his older boy, Dan Mitrione. Mitrione worked with the International Police Academy, CIA funding. He became one of the major trainers in torture for the CIA, especially the Nazi methods. He incorporated it in training of South American countries and their governments so they know how to do the fascist torture. He was eventually kidnapped and murdered by the Tupamaro guerrillas. The Costa Gavras film State of Siege is about Dan Mitrione. This was a close friend of Jim Jones. Jim Jones, who his landlady called him a gangster who used a Bible instead of a gun, had no money, but suddenly had enough money and the influx of support of this Green Beret named Brightman, who came into his life at that point in Indiana, that he could go to Brazil and minister from there in an expensive house. The people locally saw that his groceries were delivered and his transportation was handled in U.S. Embassy cars. So the State Department and the embassy there were supporting his operations. This was a precursor to political coup activity and covert operations CIA in Brazil. He regularly traveled to the CIA headquarters there. He came back with $100,000 in his pocket, which he claimed had been payoff for the good sex that he gave to the ambassador's wife when he slept with her one night. You can believe that if you want. I think it's intelligence money directly out of the U.S. Embassy to help him set up then in Ukiah, California. He was no liberal. He was tight with the head of the John Birch Society. He was supporting Nixon's presidency at the time. And it was set up as an armed camp. It had electric fences. It had guard towers. It had black-suited guards who were armed. It had guard dogs. It was called Happy Haven's Rest Home. You don't want to live there. And the people that were given under his care were 150 children given over as wards of the court to him. He had no license to do anything. He had no health license. He got elderly out of homes. He got psychiatric patients from the institutions. People who were institutionalized and that met the criteria that Irvin laid out in 1974. These were predominantly women, elderly, black, and children. The violent members of society were put under Jones's care. He moved into San Francisco. He established links with Moscone there, financial and otherwise. Moscone put his people in the welfare department. He took indigenous people off of the streets, indigent people that didn't have any way, no families, no money to defend themselves, recruited them into this phony church, this religion that he had studied in Philadelphia, how to do it, Father Divine and another little religion there, and he got them under his control. He was using a variety of very sophisticated control techniques, and when they threatened to blow the lid in the media on what he was doing, he moved the whole operation, and this was also the time when the Center for Study of Violent Behavior was publicly opposed and knocked out. He moved the whole operation into the jungles of Guyana. I talked to air traffic controllers who said that on arrival, the people taken off the planes there that were black adults were bound and gagged on the way to Jonestown. I talked to people who lived 5 miles away in the jungle, didn't know a single black was living in Jonestown. The only people allowed in and out were a white elite. You call them the basketball team or the guards. These people were allowed to have money, they were allowed to have weapons, they had the best food at the camp, they were allowed to come and go. The blacks and the women, the elderly and the children were being drugged daily by a group of 70 nurses and this phony doctor, Schacht, who worked there, S-C-H-A-C-H-T, same spelling as Hjalmar Schacht, right, Minister of Finance for Nazi Germany, whose family went to Houston, where this guy is from. I believe he's the grandson in the Schacht family. This Schacht is the one that developed the term Arbeit macht frei on the gates over Auschwitz, work will make you free. And this guy was like a camp doctor. He sutured without anesthetic. They had basically a concentration camp, and they were developing it with drugs. The drugs found by the Guyanese police after the mass murder in Jonestown were enough to drug the population of Georgetown, Guyana, over 120,000 people for a period of over a year. That many drugs for this population of about 1,200 people, about 900 of whom were taking the drugs, being forced to take the drugs. In the very earliest photos of the dead that I studied, you can see medical tags on the wrists or the legs. These people, massive medical and daily records were reportedly kept, all disappeared. But the drugs were left behind, and they were the same drugs that were part of MK Ultra. The haloperidol and the truth serums and all of the controlled drugs. One Footlocker had 11,000 doses of Thorazine as a control drug that they used. They did public rape and sexual humiliation. They did beatings. They used electric cattle prods. They did live burial. They combined methods for mass control. They kept people up day and night, worked them 16 to 18 hours a day, screamed at them all night so they couldn't sleep, broke down their resistance because they were trying to create a slave labor force in the back jungles of Guyana. They had tried from 1909 on to move labor into that sector. No one wanted to live there. In fact, the next to final solution for the Jews in 1937 had 7 places to move the Jews. The 6th place was Matthews Ridge